We're back at it today. Really important lesson. Something hopefully you remember a little bit from Algebra 1, but it is factoring. Okay, we're going to do lots of different factoring here, just kind of depending. We'll see if we cut this video in half and make it into two. We'll see. Okay, but factoring is really important. You need to make sure you understand this. There are lots of different ways that teachers go about teaching it, and if you've got a way that works for you, go for it. This is the way that helps me best go through it, and so that's what I'm going to try to explain to you today. But today we're working on factoring and understanding those concepts. Let's get to it. So when we factor here, the most important thing with factoring is to understand what this is. All right. And so if we factor x squared plus 8x minus 20, okay, I'm going to pull up. All right. So I'm going to graph that picture real quick. So we are trying to factor x squared plus 8x minus 20. It's a parabola. We knew it was going to be a parabola because it was x squared. But understand what we're finding when we factor. We are finding the places where that graph is 0. This graph is 0 at negative 10 and 2. That's important. If you were to take negative 10 and you were to plug it into this equation, you would get 0. If you took 2 and plugged it in, you would get 0. That is what factoring is all about. It's trying to figure out where are we going to get 0, where does it cross the x-axis. So to do that, we're going to ask ourselves two questions. What multiplies together to get the last number in the trinomial? So we're doing this to do quadratics. This is how we solve quadratics, by factoring. What two numbers multiply together to get 20? And out of those combinations, which of those are going to add together to get the middle number, to get our b value, to get 8? All right, so what numbers multiply together to get 20? Well, what options do we have? We have 1 times 20. We've got 2 times 10. We've got 4 times 5. All right, all of those work. Our decision then is, once we've decided those are our numbers, which of those numbers is either going to add or subtract to get 8? Okay, more specifically, not only does it have to multiply to get 20, it's got to get negative 20 as well. All right, so negative 20, it has to add to get 8. So is it possible, since it's negative, one of the two signs needs to be negative, can I go 20 plus 1 and get 8, or 20 minus 1 and get 8? No, you can't do that. Okay, it's not that. 4 plus 5, no, that would get me 9. 5 minus 4, no, that would get me 1. That's not it. The one I want is 10 and 2, because if I took 10 minus 2, that would get me 8. 10 times negative 2, that would get me negative 20, like I'd like. And so how do we factor this thing? X minus 2 and x plus 10. That is factoring this. It is reverse FOIL. All right. X minus 2 and x plus 10. If I were to FOIL that back together, it would get me this. But we are factoring it. We are breaking it down. So same thing on the next one. Two numbers together that multiply together to get me negative 42. Well, 1 and 42, 2 and 21, 3 and 14, 6 and 7. They have to add to get negative 11, add or subtract. 1 and 42 isn't going to cut it. 2 and 21 is not going to get there. 6 and 7 aren't, but 14 and 3 will. 14 minus 3, I'm sorry, it's negative 11. So negative 14 plus 3 is what I'm going to have to factor. Negative 14 times 3, that gets me negative 42. And when I add them, it gets the middle to get negative 11. All right, so looking at this last one, I need two numbers to multiply together to get me 81. Well, that would be 9 and 9. Let's go 9 times 9, or 3 times 27. 81 and 1. I think that's it. All right, so out of those combinations, I need one of them to add or subtract to get me negative 18. Well, 9 plus 9 gets me 18. Now, I want negative 18, so negative 9 minus 9, that would get me negative 18, and negative 9 times negative 9, that would get me positive 81. And so I'm going to factor that into x minus 9 and x minus 9. That is what we're trying to do. And so again, remember what these values are. So we had x plus 10 and x minus 2, and when we look at the picture of that, I got an answer of negative 10 and positive 2. They're the flip of it, but that is the ultimate goal of this problem. Okay, and we'll get to that more as we go on, but that's where these numbers are coming from. So we are factoring. It's a trinomial. It's in its normal form, a, b, c. What two numbers multiply together to get me 21? Well, 7 and 3, 21 and 1. Can either of those numbers, can you add or subtract them to get negative 10? So we are trying to go x something, x something. Can either of those numbers add to get negative 10? Well, 21 and 1 can't, but 7 and 3 can. X minus 7 and x minus 3, those two numbers, if I add them together, will get me negative 10. And if I multiply them, they'll get me positive 21. And again, remember what this is. This is the opposite of foiling. If I were to take these two things, which you don't want to do, but if I were to take these two things and foil them together, multiply the x's together, x times negative 3 is negative 3x. And then multiply these together. Negative 7 times x is negative 7x. And negative 7 times negative 3, oh, that's positive 21. Notice how I stack these. I've always liked that. Negative 3, oh, that's minus 10x. That's plus 20. Oh, it's the same thing. All we are doing is rewriting this in a new fashion because this is going to allow me to find where it crosses the x-axis. And that's what we're trying to do when we factor. All right, so hopefully you're starting to get a feel for it. Let's try the next one. We're going to factor this thing. I need two numbers that multiply together to get me 30. So 3 and 10, 15 and 2, 5 and 6, 30 and 1. You don't have to list them all out every time. I'm just doing it so we get an idea. I need them to get 11. 3 and 10 aren't getting me 11. 15 and 2 won't get me 11. 5 and 6 will. So I want x plus 5, x plus 6. Because those two numbers multiplied together will get me 11. And multiplied together will get me 30, just like I wanted. Let's keep going. Letter C. Two numbers multiply together get me 12. So 12 and 1, 6 and 2, 4 and 3. They need to either add or subtract to get negative 7. All right, well, no, not 12 and 1. Not 4 and 3 will. Just kidding. I've crossed out the wrong one. 4 and 3 will. X minus 4 and x minus 3. If I add negative 4 and negative 3, that would get me negative 7. And if I multiply them, that would get me positive 12. So I've factored it correctly. Part D, two numbers multiply together to get me 18. 6 and 3, 9 and 2, 18 and 1. They got to multiply to get negative 18, add to get 3. Now, how about those two? X plus 6 and x minus 3. If I add them together, that will get me 3. If I multiply them together, that gets me negative 18. Boom, I got it. That's it. Let's do two more. Multiply together to get negative 3. Kids always flip-flop this one for some reason. Remember, you're multiplying to get the last number. So what numbers multiply to get 3? You have one option. It is 3 and 1. Those are the only two numbers that multiply to get 3. So what can we use 3 and 1 to get 2? Yeah, you can use 3 and 1. Positive 3, negative 1. If I add those two things, that gets me positive 2. If I multiply those two things, it gets me negative 3. I've factored it correctly. Letter F is the most missed factor by far. Not even close. All right. I need two numbers that multiply to get 6. So what are your options? Well, you've got 6 and 1 and 3 and 2. Okay, so 6 and 1 and 3 and 2. Can you use 6 and 1 to get 5? Absolutely. Can you use 3 and 2 to get 5? Absolutely. The key is the signs. How could I get negative 5? Well, I could do negative 3 and negative 2. Those two things added together get me negative 5. But if I multiply these two things, negative 3 times negative 2, that would get you a positive 6. And I want it to be negative 6. So my answer is not negative 3 and negative 2. Instead, I always think about this. If this sign right here is negative, I know I need one of the signs to be negative and one of the signs to be positive. That's the only way I'm going to multiply together and get a positive number there. I'm sorry, a negative number. That's the only way it's going to happen. All right, so what two numbers can I use 6 and 1 to get negative 5? Yes, x minus 6 and x plus 1. That will get me where I want to be. All right, so a little bit more different there. More different, that was rough. A little bit more of a challenge, but that's what you're trying to do. All right, that is factoring. Let's keep going on the backside. So I might have jumped the gun a little bit early here, but let's look at this. look at this problem that we're doing. This thing right here, it's the same problem. Okay, let's factor that real quick, or let's put this in vertex form. So that's what we just did last chapter, or last section. X squared plus 2x. I put the x's together, plus a blank. And then I've got minus 3 minus a blank. You could do this lots of different ways, but I'm doing it this way. So we did that. Now we're filling in the blank with half of b squared. So half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. Whatever I put in that blank, I'm putting in that blank. Then I'm going to complete the square. We're going to factor this thing. Remember, it's just taking that number and cutting it in half. Negative 3 minus, oh, that's negative 4. So let's graph it now. The plus 1 takes me left 1. The minus 4 takes me down 4. The a value is just 1, so I'm going to go up 1, over 1, up 1, over 1, up 3, over 1, 3, over 1. There is my parabola. Where did I cross the x-axis? Boom, boom. Those are called x-intercepts. And we'll get to this more later. X-intercepts, they could also be called zeros because it's where it crosses the 0 line. They could also be called roots, just because that's a name for it. And they could also be called solutions. All of those words mean the same thing. They mean those two spots. And that's like the number one most important thing about the rest of this chapter is finding those values. So where did they happen here? Oh, it happened at negative 3 and positive 1. So let's go back to this problem. That's not what we got here. We got positive 3 and negative 1. Okay, because what we want to do is figure out when these are 0. And so on the back side here, we are solving. We're going to take each of these factors and we are going to set them equal to 0. So if I solve this, I'm going to subtract 3. X is negative 3. I'm going to add 1. I'm going to add 1. X is positive 1. That is where I'm getting these two numbers from. That is what we do when we solve because we are making it equal to 0 in the end. All right, so let's try this again. So now we're going to solve the quadratic by factoring. We're finding those x-intercepts, those zeros, those roots. So to solve a quadratic, we have to factor. It's the only way we can do this. So we're going to break this up into x something, x something. Two numbers that multiply together to get me 18. 18 and 1, 9 and 2, 8. Just kidding. 6 and 3. That's enough. We're going to use 6 and 3, minus 6 and minus 3. Because negative 6 plus negative 3, that gets me negative 9. Negative 6 times negative 3, that gets me 18. But now we're solving this thing. It is equal to 0. So once we've gotten to this point, we're going to take each factor and set it equal to 0. And we're going to solve. We're going to add 6. Add 6. X is 6. We're going to add 3. Add 3. X is 3. So these two spots are where my parabola is going to cross the x-axis. So with just this little information, I know what my graph's going to look like. 3 and 6, it's a parabola and it's positive, so I know it's going to go something like that. Just that alone allows me to graph that thing pretty quickly by understanding the zeros, by understanding the solutions. Let's do another one. So this is the same thing as the front side. We're just doing more practice. Two numbers to get 40. How about 20 and 2? That's not it. 4 and 10. That's not it. What other numbers am I missing? Oh, the easy one. 8 and 5, perhaps. There we go. 8 and 5. Oh, yeah, that's going to get me negative 13. Negative 8 and negative 5. That'll multiply together, or I'm sorry, add together to get negative 13 and multiply to get positive 40. Then I'm going to take each one and make it equal to 0. X is 8, X is 5. Those are my two solutions. That's where I'm crossing the x-axis. Keep it working. When we do this, the only way you can factor, super important point, the only way you can factor is if you have a trinomial. Okay, if you've got an x squared and an x, and you're trying to factor, it must be equal to 0. So if it's not equal to 0, like this one right here, we've got to move this 4. So it says -4. I need to add 4 to both sides. That's like a huge mistake. You got to make it equal to 0. Otherwise, you can't solve it. So it's going to be -14 equals 0. You got to do that first. Once I've done that, now I can factor. Two numbers to multiply to get 14. How about 7 and 2? -7 and +2, because those two things will add to get -5 and multiply to get -14. Set them both equal to 0, because that's what I'm going to do. And solve it. X is equal to +7, just change the sign. And x is equal to -2, just change the sign. Almost done. Couple more here, and the last part's easy. All right, so first thing I got to do, make it equal to 0. So I'm going to add 8, -21, factor. Two numbers to multiply to get 21, 7 and 3 are really my only options to get -4. -7 plus 3, those two numbers multiply to get -4. I'm sorry, add to get -4 and multiply to get -21. What are my solutions going to be, though? I need to change the signs, +7 and -3. Those are my two solutions. So that's an important concept here. There's something else we can do here, and this is just kind of a little quick thing here. Solving quadratics by factoring. Okay, this is called the difference of squares, though. So we're going to do a difference of squares problem here. You can solve these problems in lots of different ways, but we are going to factor them. We could technically not need factoring here, but we're going to do it with factoring. So if I wanted to factor this, it's not a trinomial because there isn't a middle part. It's a 0x, right? There's no middle term. And so if I wanted to factor this, I want to think of what two numbers multiply together to get me 49. Well, that would be 7 and 7. But they need to add to get 0. There is no middle term. Well, the only option we could do here is one of them needs to be positive and one of them needs to be negative. Because if I took 7 minus 7, that would get me nothing in the middle, 0x. And if I multiplied them, it would get me -49 like I wanted. Now, if we solve them, x is -7, x is +7. So take them equal to 0 and solve. But if it's difference of squares, or in other words, if you can square root both numbers and they're the same even value, not even, but the same value, then you can break it up, one being positive and one being negative. It is called the difference of squares. Difference meaning one's positive and one's negative. So same thing can apply here. Okay, it's not a trinomial, it's a binomial. One is squared, one isn't. There is a 0x term in the middle. And so by using what we know here, we can factor this. Now, a little bit of a difference here is it's not just x squared, it's 9x squared. Well, what would multiply together to get 9x squared? Well, 3x times 3x, that would get me 9x squared. And then there isn't a middle term, and the two other numbers need to add to get -25, or multiply to get -25. So how am I going to do that? -5 and +5. I'm going to take each thing and basically square root that 25, make one positive, one negative. Then I'm going to take each one and set it equal to 0. I'm going to add 5 and then divide by 3. 5/3 divide by 3 and -5/3. Those are my two answers here. Go fast here. This one, I can square root both. I can square root both, so I can go x plus 4 and x minus 4, because those two numbers multiply to get -16 and add to get me 0. What are my answers going to be? -4 and +4. Last one, I can square root both numbers, and so that's going to be 6x and 6x, because if I multiply those together, it get me 36x squared. And to get -9, +3, and -3. Take each factor and set it equal to 0. X is going to be -1/2. And if this one's -1/2, you know what this one's going to be. This one is going to be, this one is going to be +1/2. That's difference of squares. Not something crazy important, but it's good to recognize because it makes your problems easier. All right, that's factoring. That's the basics of factoring. That's a lot. Okay, remember they need to multiply together to get the last number and add or subtract to get the middle number. We'll continue here in a second, with factoring when a is not 1, a little bit more of a challenge, but once you figure it out, it's not too bad at all. It's the same thing once you figure it out. Hope it helps. Ask me when you have questions.